So today, as I mentioned to your class representative, and handle the renal system today. Of all, the system is quite small. It doesn't involve a lot, and it's something I can summarize rather in a short session. Much of it entail anatomy and histology. And once you have quite a good understanding of the two of them, adding some cherry on top of it to make the whole system complete by understanding the physiology and how the kidney work will complete the process. Among the functions of the kidney is the elimination of waste product, but as we later see, it works quite closely with the cardiovascular system in maintaining some other function. But in this class, we'll focus entirely on the elimination of waste product. It's equally an endocrine gland. If you remember on our last session that we saw, it secretes some hormone. And among the hormone that it secretes is 125 hydroxycholecalciferol, or simply the activated vitamin D, which is used in the process of calcium metabolism. The other two hormones being secreted include erythropoietin, which we'll cover it in details when we see the cardiovascular system, but it's involved in the process of erythropoiesis, or the synthesis of red blood cells. And finally, the third hormone is an hormone called renin, which regulates some other system called the renin-angiotensin system that is involved in the regulation of blood pressure. We'll cover that one in details in the cardiovascular system section. So some other functions include an aspect of homeostasis. So that's the balancing water in the body. That includes the salinity and osmolarity. It also regulates the electrolytes, majorly sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium. It has an acid-base balance aspect, and also indirectly regulating the blood pH. The aspect of blood pressure regulation, we handle that one while reviewing the cardiovascular. I talk about the blood production and the activation of vitamin D into an hormone that is 125. So anatomically wise, you still remember while you reviewed your regional anatomy of the pelvis together with the abdomen, that the kidneys are retroperitoneal on the posterior wall, meaning they are in between the muscles of the back and the peritoneum that is covering the abdomen. And it's made up of the two kidney, and these are the two glands that we talked about them in the previous class, the suprarenal gland that have some other functions. So the whole system includes the kidney, which are two in numbers, two ureters connected to one bladder and one urethra. And still, if you remember in your anatomy, that the liver displaces the right kidney slightly downward, and it's slightly lower compared to the left. Histologically, so the kidney, we can divide it into a cortical region, which is the outer region, and an inner region that we call it the medulla. And we have a calyces, which are just some smaller spaces where the urine will be collected. We have the columns, which are simply the extensions of the cortex and form a cup-shaped structures together with the calyces, as seen in that diagram. In terms of the blood supply, the kidney receives about 25% of the cardiac output. That is a significant higher if you compare in terms of the surface area. It even receives a higher blood volume or cardiac output compared to the brain, which receives about 20%. That blood volume or that higher cardiac output is not for the utilization by the kidney for metabolism, but rather to filter the blood, being the sole function of the kidney. The supplies from the aorta, which the renal artery branches from it. It forms the segmental artery, and will have other segments of artery, which will finally form the efferent arteriole that feeds into the glomerular capillaries, which has a smaller diameter, and exit via a slightly rather more smaller diameter called the efferent, and that one has an implication as we'll see later. So the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. And in the kidney, there are millions of them, and it's responsible for the process of urine formation. Structure-wise, it's made up of the glomerulus and the renal tubule. So the glomerulus is just a specialized capillary bed as any other capillary bed that is found in any other part of the body, where we have a connection between the arterial blood circulation and the other end of it, which is the venous circulation. In between, you have the capillary, and the pressure is usually reduced significantly, and the cells are very thin to ensure that we have a process that will be utilized later. These were the arterial that I talk about, that the afferent arterial has a larger diameter and the efferent has a smaller diameter. In terms of the principles of physics of the fluid flow or fluid dynamics, the pressure will be built up inside the capillary, and that pressure will cause the fluid part of the blood to exit through the capillary pores. So the glomerulus is located within the capsule. So we have the capsule here, and in between we have a dense connection of capillary bed, which we call it the glomerulus. So still a diagram illustrating on the same, that we have several sections of it. We have the glomerulus, and in between we have some tubes that are highly folded, and we call that one because they are closely near to the glomerulus. We call them proximal because of the proximity to the glomerulus or the Bowman's capsule. And then we have a descending and an ascending loop, and together with the convoluted tubule at the distal end of it. So we classify the neurons, or the nephron rather, depending on their location within the kidney. We have some located within the cortical region or the cortex, and we refer them to the cortical nephrons. We have some that are located at the junction between the medulla and the cortex, and we call those the juxtamedullary nephrons. And in between them, we have some capillaries that circles around the tubules, and you call them the peritubular capillaries. And they arise from the efferent, and the purpose is usually to enhance the process of reabsorption. And to achieve that one, the blood flow through the peritubular capillaries is really so slow to ensure we have a maximum absorption process. These are the actual processes that take place in the urine formation, and these are the processes that we are only interested in this class. And once you understand the process of urine formation, will be done with the physiology of the renal system. The process is divided into 3 stages. We have the process of filtration, reabsorption, and secretion, and each of them take place in a very specific region in the nephron, as we'll see as we progress. So the filtration process takes place in the Bowman's capsule, where specifically at the capillaries. And the process is non-selective, where the blood is forced into small pores under high pressure, and the liquid part of blood, all of it will be forced to filter out of the capillaries. So after filtration, some of it will later be reabsorbed. These are what the body requires later. So much of the water will be reabsorbed, including the glucose and amino acids and some ions. Most of the reabsorption process, which take place from all the way from the proximal convoluted tubule all the way to the distal part of it, and even to the collecting tubule, is a passive process where it uses the process of either diffusion or osmosis for the case of water. But you have cases of a primary active transport, and secondary active transport will be used to reabsorb some other materials. The nitrogenous wastes that are excreted include urea. Urea is a byproduct in the urea cycle, where deamination of amino acid takes place, and we end up with ammonia, being very toxic. So it'll have to be combined later into a more stable element, and we end up with urea. Uric acid is a byproduct for the metabolism of purines in the body, and much of it is excreted in the kidney. And in case we have a buildup of uric acid, we end up with a condition called hyperuricemia that will later lead into a type of an arthritis called gouty arthritis. We equally have creatinine. Creatinine is a byproduct of the breakdown of muscle tissue, And being that it doesn't usually get reabsorbed, so it's quite important in measuring the functionality of the kidney, because the level of it that is being able to be secreted from urine measures the functionality of the kidney. And you'll later hear a condition or a test called the UECs, or kidney function test. It simply measures the level of urea in the blood and correlate it with how much of it is expected to be produced in the day and how much has been excreted in a day, and give a rough estimate of the function of the kidney. So all those materials are not reabsorbed, and equally the excess water sometimes cannot be reabsorbed, but that one is dependent on the osmolarity of the body. So reabsorption is, so finally we end up with a process of secretion. So some materials cannot be reabsorbed back or secreted from the blood, and they have to be moved from the blood into the peritubular capillaries. And an example of those one are hydrogen and potassium ion together with the creatinine, and they have to be secreted directly from the capillaries into the renal tubules. So diagrammatically wise, so we'll start all the process from here, from the Bowman's capsule, where we have a higher hydrostatic pressure. It will force the blood to exit, and the journey begins by reabsorbing all the required element, and it moves all the way to the loop of Henle, up to the ascending loop, and into the descending convoluted tubule. So at the collecting duct, we have the receptors here for an hormone that we did talk about it, that was being secreted from the posterior pituitary gland. So that's the ADH, or vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone. So once it activates the receptors here, it increases the reabsorption of water and ensure that a lot of water is not lost in the body. But however, institution assume that you immediately take a lot of water, so it deactivates the secretion of the ADH, and the receptors are blocked, and you are able to produce a lot of diluted urines in the process. So for individuals who have the issues with the receptor, for example, with this receptor, they end up producing a lot of diluted urine, and we call that one diabetes insipidus. You end up with forming urine, which will be stored at the bladder. And later, once the bladder usually stretches, the voiding takes place. But these are the characteristics of the normal urine. The color is usually somewhat a little bit yellow in color because of the urochrome, which is a byproduct of the destruction or the heme synthesis. And also urine are sterile, and they only become unsterile once they pass through the ureter, where we have some normal flora there. But while they're still within the bladder, they're still sterile. And unless someone has a urinary tract infection, that is when the urine become unsterile. So the color is usually, the color of urine because of slight traces of ammonia give you that aromatic smell. In terms of the pH, we say that usually towards a bit of the acidic side, and the specific gravity is just slightly above water by that magnitude. So the ureters connect the kidneys into the bladder, and they are continuous with the renal pelvises, and they run behind the peritoneum, so they are still retroperitoneal. So the gravity aids in moving the urine from the kidneys into the bladder. So the bladder itself is made up of that shape. So it has some region, and it's made up of the muscles. The muscles are smooth muscles, and they are made up of 3 layers: the internal, the medial, and the inner, which is made up of some transitional epithelium, and we call those the detrusor muscles. So this smaller region where we have the urethra, we have the internal sphincter there, and that region is called the trigone. So the urethra is just a very thin wall, and it carries the urine from the bladder into the outside. And we have 2 sphincters here. You remember in our previous class, we said that the lower 1/3 of the vagina is made up of skeletal muscles. So those skeletal muscles form the pelvic floor muscles, sometimes what you call the sphincter or the external urethral sphincter. So the internal is made up of smooth muscles, meaning it is involuntary in control. you can't have a conscious control of it. And the external one being made up of skeletal muscles, you have a conscious control of it. And right now, if you feel like you are a little bit pressed up, you still be able to hold it for some time, courtesy of the external urethral sphincter. We have a differences in terms of gender. So in females, it's really smaller one, and later you will learn when you do a process called catheterization, or simply inserting a catheter into the bladder, that in females, usually you only insert a very small length, which is about an inch, and you should be able to balloon it and get the urine out. But for male, so it goes all the way through the shaft of the penis, and it gives us about an 8-inch. In terms of the location, in male, it's located within the shaft of the penis, and in female, it's located along the anterior vaginal wall. So sometimes locating the urethra in female requires some skills that you learn with time in mastering the process of catheterization. In still on gender differences, so in female, it only carries urine, and in males, I think you remember I told you it's an SGR that it carries both the sperms and the urine. So the process of maturation or voiding or just peeing or passing urine start once the bladder gets full, and the stretching will activate some receptors which will send an impulse into the sacral region of the sacral region of the spinal cord, so through specifically the pudendal nerve. And this activation will send back a signal, or rather an impulse, which is called the motor reflex. And the reflex will causes the relaxation of both the internal and the external sphincter. And once we have the relaxation of them, so the urine should be able to move from the bladder into the urethra. And once we have that movement, so you can increase that one consciously by reducing the pressure inside the abdomen. And that one is achieved by the contraction of the anterior muscles, those are the rectus muscles. And this will reduce the pressure and will reduce the volume and later increase the pressure, and you are able to void by pressing down. So that is the summary of the renal system. Much of it, as I said, is involved with anatomy and structures, and physiology just concerns with the process of urine formation, and that one occurs through those 3 stages that I illustrated. And that's the process of ultrafiltration, selective reabsorption, and later the secretion. And that one ends the process. And the remaining process that is of physiological significance is the process of voiding, which we'll still talk about it when we review the nervous system. So that brings us into a short end of this session. But if you realize I've really put it so much in a summary form, that if you look in details of the actual processes that take place specifically in the process of reabsorption, involve some very specific processes. For example, glucose. Glucose is reabsorbed using the process of a secondary active transport, where we have some specific receptors within the kidney, specifically the glucose transporter type 2, to distinguish it from the one available in the GIT for absorption, as we see later. So it will be your initiative to go into details and see exactly the exact process involved in that. If you have any questions, I think I saw someone raising their hand. You can always slide the question in the chat section, and I will be able to answer it before the class end.